My dear folks, J. Scott Phillips here, and today we are bound for murder and revenge with a look at Arthur Conan Doyle's second ever Sherlock Holmes story, The Sign of the Four, which was first published in the February 1890 issue of Lippincot's monthly magazine. And this is an offering of mine to the now annual BookTube event every February called Holmes is Where the Heart Is. And it is to promote all of us to be reading Sherlock Holmes. And it is hosted by 5 great BookTube channels. And let's just take a quick rundown here through them. We'll start off with Jim at Mystery and Mayhem. And then another co-host, we've got Mark at Book Time with Elvis. Then Greg at Another Bibliophile Reads. Randy Ray, the literate Texan, and Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics. I'll leave links to all of their announcement videos down below. And I am not one of the co-hosts. I'm just a lifelong Sherlock Holmes fan that I just had to hop into a hansom cab here and join in the hunt. And so I'm joining in for week 1 here, which is to be looking at the long canon. And those are reading any one or all of the 4 novel-length Sherlock Holmes stories written by Arthur Conan Doyle. Next week, week 2, will be about the short canon, focusing on the 60 or so short stories that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote. The week after that will be about pastiche fiction. Those are Sherlock Holmes stories that are written by others in the style and tradition of Sherlock Holmes, about Sherlock and Watson and their continuing adventures. And then week 4, I think, is kind of a catch-all, where it's more reading nonfiction about Arthur Conan Doyle or about Sherlock Holmes or the Victorian era and things related to the Sherlock Holmes mystique. But today I'm going to be focusing on the second novel, The Sign of the Four. Last year, for Holmes is Where the Heart Is, I did 2 videos. I did one about the very first novel, the first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, and I'll leave a link to that video down below. And then I did one on the first short story, A Scandal in Bohemia. So this video fits right between those 2. And so I guess we should probably start off kind of where those other videos left off, or rather between those 2 videos, what was going on with Dr. Doyle between those 2 stories. And so let's just pay a little house call to Dr. Doyle here and see what he was up to. So it was late in 1887 when A Study in Scarlet first appeared. And at that time, Doyle himself had been just recently married to his wife, Tui. And they were living in Southsea at the time, where he had a medical practice that was kind of struggling. But at the same time, he was becoming interested in spiritualism, of all things. And he'd been attending some seances and table rapping sessions, things like that, with some other friends of his that were interested in the same kind of a thing. And he was becoming convinced that there was some kind of a spirit realm, but his medical mind just pushed him towards skepticism. There were some famous mediums that were being exposed as frauds popping up in the news from time to time. And even though he was leaning towards believing in spiritualism, he was all for exposing any frauds. Just as a doctor and a member of the medical profession, he believed that as important as medicine is, anyone practicing it fraudulently should be exposed. So kind of the same way of looking at those 2 different interests of his. And he was becoming convinced, as I say, of the existence of a spiritual world, but he insisted that it must have a rational explanation. There had to be a scientific basis that just still had yet to be uncovered. Now, Doyle had gotten some of his work published before A Study in Scarlet, but as the tradition was of the day, the publications that would run the type of stories that he would write usually did not credit the author, so they were published anonymously. And so even though he was getting great accolades sometimes on his stories, nobody knew who he was, so he wasn't getting more work as a result of that. But once A Study in Scarlet was published and had his name prominent on the cover of the magazine as the author, he was able to get other stories published a little more easily then. And he would tend to write stories. There were long stories and short stories that often featured elements of spiritualism and the occult and the paranormal as some aspect of the stories, not always, but he really preferred writing historical and adventure fiction. That was the type of literature that he really preferred. So by late August of 1889, in addition to A Study in Scarlet, Doyle's historical novels Micah, Clarke, and The Mystery of Clobber had been published, and now he was working on another one, The White Company, and he thought this was going to be his early masterpiece. Now, these novels and other stories that Doyle was able to sell now were a nice supplement to his medical income. However, his medical practice itself was not really paying the bills like he had hoped that it would by now, and he was starting to raise a family. His wife, Tui, had just given birth to their first child, a daughter, Mary Louise. And so Doyle was really motivated now to be making more money. And so he was considering changing the focus of his medical practice from general medicine to ophthalmology. That was going to be more lucrative in his mind because ophthalmology was sort of taking off as a burgeoning branch of medicine due to some recent technical advances in making ophthalmology more practical and reliable. And people wanted to take care of their eyes now. And so he was starting to look into how to get the training, the schooling, and certified to practice ophthalmology. But at the same time, his writing was gaining some steam, and he found himself literally steaming to London at the invitation of Joseph M. Stoddard, who was the editor of Lippincott monthly magazine in America. And Stoddard had this idea of launching an English edition of Lippincott that would be published out of London, and then it would be published simultaneously. One issue would come out in America, out of Philadelphia, and the other one out of London in England. And he had brokered a deal with Ward Lock and Company to be the London publisher. And Ward Lock and Company just happened to be the same publisher that had originally published A Study in Scarlet in the Beeton's Christmas Annual. And so Stoddard was looking for recommendations of English writers that would appeal to his American readers. And Ward Lock and Company, the editor that had originally bought A Study in Scarlet, recommended this fellow Arthur Conan Doyle. He wrote a story about this detective Sherlock Holmes. Maybe you should put Doyle on your list of writers to talk to. So Stoddard invited Doyle to come to London to discuss such a thing. And now this was good news to Doyle because in those days there were no real copyright laws in America. An American publisher could reprint anything written by an author overseas and have it published and printed and sell it without ever paying any royalties to the original author. There was just no law to enforce like that. However, Lippincott was a respectable publisher and did pay royalties to authors from overseas. So that sounded good to Doyle, and so he hopped on a train and headed to London to meet Stoddard. The dinner had been arranged for the evening of August 30th, 1889, at the Langham Hotel in London, and it was a very modern hotel. It had electric lights, it had air conditioning, it had hot and cold running water in all the rooms, and it had England's first hydraulic elevators and its own post office and telegraph service. So it had all the modern amenities of the day and then beyond what most hotels of the day had. And this dinner had been set up for 4 people, so Stoddard, Doyle, and a couple other people. But the other three were waiting. They were sitting at the dinner table waiting for Doyle, and Doyle was not showing up. Where is he? So after about 20 or 30 minutes, Stoddard is getting impatient, as are the other guests. And Stoddard knows that Doyle had checked into the hotel. Had he fallen asleep or something? So he decides he's going to go up and find out what's going on, and marches up to Doyle's room. Now, Doyle has been nervous about this meeting anyway, but the problem of why he's running late is because he was trying to get dressed for the dinner, and the buttonhole on the back of his starch collar had ripped open, and he couldn't button it to the shirt. In those days, collar and shirt were separate, and they were buttoned together and then held together more formally with some kind of a tie. But the collar and the shirt were not cooperating, and Doyle did not have any other appropriate clothing to wear to dinner to switch out to. And so Stoddard sees this and sees the dishevelment of Doyle's room. He's okay. Come with me across the hall to my room, and we'll have a housemaid come in, and she'll sew up your buttonhole, and we'll get you down to dinner. So they did that, and Doyle went down to dinner, made all of his apologies, and met the other two guests for dinner there. And one of them was a member of Parliament, Thomas Gill. And we won't go too much into his background here because it doesn't matter to the story here. But the other guest, the fourth guest, was none other than Oscar Wilde. And so Doyle was thrilled to meet him, and they just had a great dinner together. Now, Doyle really admired Wilde and was impressed with his intellect and his wit and his manners. He was just that kind of a guy, very flamboyant fellow in the London literary circles. And Doyle was surprised when Wilde told him that he had read Doyle's Micah, Clarke and had enjoyed it. So this was just a fantastic evening for Doyle, and he later in his autobiography, he called it the Golden Evening. But at some point, it was time to get down to business, and Stoddard wanted a 40,000-word novel from both Doyle and Wilde for Lippincott. And this was August, and the English edition of the magazine was supposed to premiere with the January 1890 issue. So this was coming up quick, and Stoddard needed content. And Doyle agreed right away and signed a contract with Stoddard over dinner. So Doyle was excited, and he had an idea of writing another Sherlock Holmes story because he had been getting letters from readers that were clamoring for more adventures of this young man, Sherlock Holmes. So he also knew that Stoddard wanted a kind of a spicy title to help sell the magazine. And I don't know if this was spicy or not, really, but Doyle proposed the title The Sign of the Six, or The Problem of the Sholtos. And also had the idea to propose to Stoddard that if in this new story, if he referred to events from A Study in Scarlet, then the sale of one, or the reading of one story, might promote the sale of the other. And if Lippincott would just reprint A Study in Scarlet for an American audience, Doyle could get some royalties for the reprinting of that. That's a deal that Ward Lock and Company did not agree to when they first published A Study in Scarlet. They paid him outright £25 to print A Study in Scarlet, and then that was it. It was an outright buy that did not result in any royalties once they published it in book form. So now Doyle thought, well, maybe he could do that by referring in one to the other and make a little more money that way. So that dinner was at the end of August 30th, 1889. And by the end of September, he had written The Sign of the Four and sent it off to Lippincott, to Stoddard, and Stoddard was thrilled with it. But Stoddard was planning on launching the new English version of Lippincott's the January 1890 issue with the novel from Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde was just dragging his feet for various reasons. He got sick. He was working on something else. His dog ate the manuscript. Whatever the reasons were, he wasn't coming through. He did finally submit something, but it was too short for the full novel-length story in the inaugural issue of Lippincott in England. So it just got postponed. But he finally did send in his story that was of the proper length, and it was Oscar Wilde's very famous The Picture of Dorian Gray, which finally got printed in the July 1890 issue. But that's another story. Let's get back to The Sign of the Four. The Sign of the Four ran in the February 1890 issue, and Doyle's original manuscript needed very little editing. Stoddard was very happy with this. In fact, all he really had to do was adjust some of the spellings and punctuations for American grammar. And readers loved the story in both countries, and Doyle was thrilled, of course. But when he read his copy of the English edition, he noticed a couple of mistakes, and one of them in chapter 1, he is referring to a post office a couple different ways. He refers to it once as the Wigmore Street Post Office, and then a little while later, he refers to it as the Seymour Street Post Office, and it should have been Wigmore in both cases. It's just talking about one post office. Shouldn't be on two different streets. And then the second problem, or the second mistake, was in chapter 2. He's talking about how it's taking place on July 7th, in the middle of the summer, and then in the next chapter, suddenly it's a foggy September night, and so there was a discrepancy there, and so he wrote a letter to Stoddard asking if these mistakes could be fixed when it was printed in the book form. And so Stoddard was going to have to try to remember this. And he did remember to fix the Wigmore Street post office name. So he did that one. But he forgot about changing the date. So it's in one chapter it's July, and the next chapter it's September for some reason, causing Sherlockian scholars ever after to be confused and grappling with debating each other about when did this story actually take place. It couldn't be in July and September. The weather conditions don't even match up according to descriptions in the story. So that was never fixed, and that would be a recurring problem for Doyle writing in Watson's name in future Sherlock Holmes stories. But the good news was that a month after The Sign of the Four appeared in the February 1890 issue, Stoddard also published A Study in Scarlet in book form for the American market, and Doyle finally started to get some royalties from his first book. So that's some of the backstory of how Doyle came to write The Sign of the Four in the first place. But let's chat a little bit now about the story itself, and then we'll wrap things up with looking at 2 or 3 of the early illustrations of The Sign of the Four. I always like to chat about the artwork that comes along with the stories we talk about here on this channel. So we'll do that in a few minutes here. But The Sign of the Four itself, by the time Doyle wrote this, and since he had written A Study in Scarlet, he had been writing quite a bit and getting published quite a bit, and so had matured quite a bit as a writer. And as a result, I think so too has the character of Sherlock Holmes in The Sign of the Four. Not that he wasn't already a really interesting character in The Study in Scarlet. In that book, he already had his powers of observation and deduction pretty well fleshed out, and already made him a really unique character. But now, in The Sign of the Four, we are introduced to his cocaine habit. And so now we are seeing that Holmes, as brilliant of a mind as he is, also has this fatal flaw. And we see that Watson is concerned about it as a medical man. It really disturbs him to see such a brilliant mind possibly destroying itself for whatever reason. And so he challenges Holmes on that, and Holmes is pretty forthcoming, talks about why he uses the cocaine and when he needs it and when he doesn't need it. And we also see the further evolution of the friendship between Holmes and Watson. And of course, all these things will carry on down through future Sherlock Holmes stories. But maybe the most important thing that happens in this book as far as the continuing Sherlock Holmes saga is the introduction of Mary Morstan into the Sherlock Holmes series. And she is the client that comes to Holmes at the beginning of the story. Her father has disappeared years before, and now has been, for the last several years, been receiving mysterious parcels in the mail, each one containing a single, very valuable pearl of excellent quality. For no apparent reason, no explanation, until this recent one has shown up now, came with a note saying that this note is from an unknown friend who feels that she has been terribly wronged, and this unknown friend wants to come clean and put an end to this wrongdoing if she will only come and meet him at the third pillar from the left at the Lyceum Theater tonight. And she can bring 2 friends with her as long as they're not the police. So, of course, she's going to bring Holmes and Watson. Now, the reason she's such an important character to the Sherlock Holmes series is that she becomes the romantic connection with Watson in this story. And it's the story of their romance, falling in love, and ultimate marriage by the end of the story. And then we'll see in the third Sherlock Holmes story, the very first short story that Doyle ever wrote, where at the beginning of that story, Watson is happily married. And we'll follow that romance through further stories as well. But the story itself now, of course, Holmes and Watson go with Miss Morstan to the Lyceum Theater and are immediately taken into a carriage and whisked away to some unknown destination. But Holmes is able to track it because he's watching out the window and he can recognize landmarks as they're going. So he's kind of in effect throwing mental breadcrumbs behind their trail. He knows where, so that he will know where they ultimately wind up. And so one of the great things about this story is that we are taken all over Victorian London on this grand adventure here. And ultimately, we wind up in this very exciting boat chase down the Thames, pursuing the Agra treasure, which is in the boat ahead. And that's the whole resolution of the story is the mystery of the Agra treasure. And that boat chase scene, if you ask me, is just as exciting as any chase scene in any book that you might read today, or any movie, actually, car chase, or any kind of a chase that you might see in a modern movie. Very exciting. And it, again, marks the landmarks going down the Thames as the boat that Holmes and Watson and Inspector Athelney Jones are on, chasing the other boat, getting closer and closer and having near collisions and things along the way, and then its final resolution. Very exciting. You must read this story if you haven't yet. Just as exciting as any Sherlock Holmes story that you might have read or ever will read, I think. But one of the interesting things about Doyle's writing is that, like many authors, he would draw from his own personal experiences of locations and things. So an interesting thing about Mary Morstan, the romantic character in the story here, echoes quite a bit of Doyle's own recent romance of his own wife not too many years earlier. And so the chemistry and everything is echoed in Watson's admiration and adoration of Miss Morstan. But he's got a dilemma that fortunately Doyle did not have. It seems that Miss Mary Morstan is to be the heir to this vast fortune, which will make her one of the richest women in England. And so that is going to quash any romantic interests that poor old Watson might have, because it would be completely inappropriate for him and Holmes to help her regain this lost family fortune and become so wealthy, and then just have this poor old country doctor begging to be wooing her. Just would not be an appropriate match in Victorian London, and this is causing Watson's his dilemma. And how is that going to be resolved then? Because we're rooting for Watson and Miss Morstan to get together somehow, but we also know that she has been wronged, that she is to come into this vast fortune, but that will completely destroy Watson's chances with her. So how can this turn out where everyone has a happy ending here? You'll have to read the story to find out if you haven't already. But like I say, Doyle would write a lot from his own experiences. And in fact, when Miss Morson comes to Holmes to begin with, she is telling the story that her father, Captain Morstan, had disappeared years earlier after he had come back home to London from serving in the army in India. And the night that that she is to meet him at the Langham Hotel, he disappears. And so Doyle is writing, paying homage to the dinner that he had with Stoddard for Lippincott, and where he met Oscar Wilde at the Langham Hotel in London, now is a very important scene in the story of The Sign of the Four. And it's interesting that he would do things like this. He did a similar thing in A Study in Scarlet, paying homage to a throwback to a name in that story. But ironically, Doyle himself was not that familiar with London. He had visited London a few times over his lifetime, and he was still a young man, but he had never stayed there for very long and never lived there. But when he was 15 years old, he came to London to visit his aunt and uncle, and one of his favorite memories of that time was visiting Madame Tussaud's wax museum in the Baker Street Bazaar. And so hence the famous address of 221B Baker Street as the digs for Holmes and Watson throughout the canon. As I say, he didn't know London very well, but you could never tell by reading these stories because the descriptions are just so spot on. If you're reading and you're not familiar with London, of course, they just kind of roll over you, and you just, at least before I really started to study the streets of London in the Victorian era, when I was first reading Sherlock Holmes, all these names and streets and everything, every street to me looked like Baker Street. Didn't matter where in London you were, whether you're out in the suburbs or wherever, everything looked the same. But Doyle himself, when he was writing these stories early on, just worked from maps and things like that, and kind of fleshed things out then just in his own imagination. Now, I guess just before we get into the illustrations here, I should explain what the sign of the four means, because it will come in handy when we look at the illustrations here. But the sign of the four refers to four crosses marked on a map, a treasure map for the Agra treasure. And this was a kind of a contract entered in by four prisoners of war shortly after the Indian Mutiny in the British Army. And they have come across a treasure and have this solemn pact that the four of them will never divulge the secret of where they have buried the Agra treasure that they hope to someday recover. And there are maps that were drawn for each of the four that are signed with the sign of the four, those four crosses along the bottom. And so when you hear the sign of the four, it's not only referring to these four prisoners that are in this sacred pact together, but also a clue that is left behind on various murdered bodies throughout the story. So now having said that, let's take a look at this first illustration. And it is the one and only illustration that we get from the first printing of the Sign of the Four from that February 1890 issue of Lippincott. And it is only signed by H.D. That's all we know of the artist here. Don't know who it was, what else they may have illustrated, if we know any of their other work. I couldn't get to the bottom of that at all. But you can see the initials H.D. in the upper left corner of the illustration, which I think is a shame that we don't know who this artist is, because I really like the illustration. The composition is great, very moody, very dark and mysterious. We have a spotlight on one character. We have another character here in complete silhouette or shadow. That's our bad guy. This is a flashback story of the Four's acquisition of the Agra treasure. And the villain of the story is Jonathan Small. That's the silhouette character there. He's a former British soldier at the time of the Indian Mutiny who had previously lost his leg to a crocodile when he was swimming in the Ganges one day. And here we see him with his wooden leg and all, encountering this little guy who's carrying the Agra treasure during an attack on Fort Agra in India. And this little guy is seeking asylum in the fort. But the three others that you see there, two lurking in the doorway and one with the spotlight on him behind the little guy, those are three Sikhs that have sworn Small into their group. And now they are conniving, the four of them together, to kill this little guy and then bury the treasure for recovery later on. And the Sikhs managed to kill the little guy, and then one of them draws a map for each of the other three, and then those are all signed with the four crosses, the sign of the four. And then that's it. We get no depiction at all of Sherlock Holmes or Watson or any of the other characters that we're familiar with, unfortunately. But then we get the first edition in book form that was published by Spencer Blackett in 1890. It had no cover illustration, but it is labeled as The Sign of Four. For some reason, they took the out of the title in England. And in America, it was always published as The Sign of the Four, as Doyle had intended the title to be. And then in England, for some reason, it was shortened to just The Sign of Four. And there was no cover illustration, as I say, but we do get another frontispiece, this time by illustrator Charles Kerr. And again, this is the only illustration we get for The Sign of the Four, or in this case, The Sign of Four. And it's only the third illustrator that has ever depicted Holmes and Watson. The first was by D.H. Friston in the Beeton's Christmas Annual for a Study in Scarlet. And the second was Doyle's own father, Charles Doyle, who did some illustrations for the first edition of A Study in Scarlet in book form. So this is still well before the general public really had a clear idea in their minds of what Holmes and Watson should look like, other than just the description in the written prose by Doyle. As familiar as we are of what Holmes and Watson look like today, not so the case back then. The illustration shows Holmes and Watson at the scene of Bartholomew Sholto's murder at Pondicherry Lodge. And Sholto has been found murdered by a poisoned dart that the poison has frozen him in death with this ghastly, sardonic smile, so rather a hideous-looking corpse. But Holmes has found on the table next to him there a sheet of paper that had the four crosses, the sign of the four drawn on it, so he's holding it up to show Watson. And if you know my videos, you know I like to talk about these drawings myself, but in this particular case, I'm going to let Vincent Starrett do the talking for me here. He had an interesting take on this illustration in his book, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. And so let me just quote Vincent Starrett here. He said, "In Kerr's conception of the tragedy at Pondicherry Lodge, we have a Holmes and Watson beside the seated corpse of Bartholomew Sholto. The scene illuminated by an oil lamp in the detective's hand. It is a competent but uninspired interpretation of the episode. Just possibly the blot upon Sherlock's lip is intended to indicate the shade cast by his prodigious nose. It looks, however, like a touch of a mustache. For the rest, there is something statue-like and dauntless in the carriage of the famous head. The legs are statesmanlike in their determined stance, and all in all, what with the somewhat epileptic corpse and Watson, the picture is a trifle comic." There was another commentator on this illustration. I can't remember who it was, and I'm only going to paraphrase here, but the line was something like, the expression on Watson's face was so horrific that it rivaled that of the corpse. And I can't remember who said that. I wish I could, but it always stuck with me, and I always get a chuckle out of it. So now we'll take a look at this last illustration here, and it is from the 1892 second edition, published by George Newnes in London. So again, we see the title, The Sign of Four, in the British tradition here. And up above, behind the lettering, we see a copy of the treasure map with the sign of the four marked on it. And on the cover, we see Watson has just delivered the recovered Agra treasure box to Mary Morstan, and it has not been opened until now, but the key has been lost, so Watson has to pry it open. And here we see that Watson and Miss Morstan are getting their first glimpse inside. And then on the spine, we see Holmes examining the copy of the treasure map with the sign of four on it that was left behind by Miss Morstan's father, Captain Morstan, before he disappeared from the Langham Hotel all those years ago. I always really liked those old illustrations that were impressed onto those cloth hardback covers back in the day. I wish we had more of that nowadays. You do see them from time to time on special editions, but they're usually kind of pricey. But back in those days, it was pretty commonplace. And there you have it, folks. A look at the sign of the four, or the sign of four, depending on which side of the pond you're on. It's always fun to take a look back at the story behind the story, and then as well as the artwork, which I always like to do. But let me know in the comments down below if you have read The Sign of the Four and what you thought about it, or maybe you have another Sherlock Holmes story that is a favorite. Let me know. We like to chat about those kinds of things. That's kind of why we're here, after all. And then just one more thing. Once again, like I did with A Study in Scarlet and A Scandal in Bohemia, my Sherlock Holmes nerdiness has come out once again. And I created a Google map pinpointing all the locations of the Sign of the Four this time. And so if you want to have a little fun with me running around Victorian London, or to some of the scenes overseas with the prisoners and the four, I'll leave a link to the map down below. Then if you feel like it, I wouldn't mind reading any comments about the map. Do you like those maps? I have a lot of fun putting them together, but I know it's kind of a goofy thing to do, but it's just fun to follow along with a story by picturing in my head where these things are actually taking place, and it gives the story even more to chew on. But we'll wrap it up with that, and thanks for watching again. It's a lot of fun to put these together, and until the game is afoot again, thanks a lot.